What's up, everyone, and welcome to ClearTalk. So in this video, we're going to be talking about no tax on tips. And while the administration has been talking about how amazing this is for workers all across America and how it will save millions in tax breaks, the real question is to what degree this actually is going to wind up hurting real wages across the country and even potentially causing more workers to be placed on tip salaries. So we're going to talk about this. Thank you very much for joining me here on Clear Talk. If you would like to check out more videos from the channel, please do so. Consider subscribing, like, share, comment, all the good stuff to get more videos in front of more people. If you like to check out videos from my other channels, JMDPLAY, Puzzling there. If you like what you see there, consider subscribing to those as well. That'd be amazing to help grow the channels and get more views and videos in front of people. If you want to support in any way, there's Patreon there for $3 a month. You can support any of the channels that you would like to help grow those channels, to help grow Patreon, to help grow the JMD Nation as much as and contribute to however you would like. Any contribution or support you give is very much appreciated, and I thank you very much. And if you're returning, you're freaking amazing. You are amazing. Keep coming back over and over and over and over again, because you are what makes JMD Nation. So yes, please support and help. If anything, just comment. That would be a big thing. All right. So the reason why I'm talking about this is because Trump here on his True Social apparently he went to a local or some restaurant. I think it was Varsity. I don't even know what the restaurant was, but he in a way of promoting his no tax on tips, he goes here for this PR stunt basically, and having all these employees, his laughing thing, blah blah blah. He's some of those workers, as pointed out, have been working here 20-30 years. And that this is amazing thing for them. No more tax on tips. They're all cheering, yay. And again, them stating, hey, this is a benefit to you because now after all these years of you having to pay taxes on your tips, now you don't. So this will be more money in your pocket. So yeah, this is just view a couple of these.
Yes.
Sorry. Okay.
No tax on tips.
Yes.
No tax on overtime. Did that matter?
Yes. Yes.
She's worked here for almost 50 years.
Yes.
She paid tax for all those years on those tips, right?
I appreciate it.
But not anymore. No more tax on tips.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody.
All right, so yeah, there's multiple videos of him engaging, going behind the counter and taking photo ops like this one here. All these different things that he's shown, he's posted up on this matter. But when we break it down, what does the tax on tips actually do, and what could potentially create in our country? All right, everything we need to know. This is by the Economic Policy Institute. All right, it's a really good breakdown. I read through all of this. It goes question by question, what could happen and how this could be, over time change the way workers are paid in the U.S. In the 2025 Republican budget bill, sometimes called the Big Beautiful Bill Act, created a new federal income tax deduction for tipped income. The Trump administration has trumpeted this policy as a substantial victory for workers. In reality, it is not. Although some tipped workers will have higher after-tax income as a result, most workers, including a large portion of tipped workers, will not benefit from this policy whatsoever. In fact, many workers will likely be harmed in the long run by the downward pressure the policy puts on employer paid wages. More broadly, the 2025 tax bill that created the tip income deduction simultaneously enacted massive cuts to healthcare, energy, food assistance programs that will cause tremendous harm for millions of low-income households, including some with tipped workers, all to finance tax cuts to the ultra wealthy. All right. Here we go. So, did the 2025 tax bill eliminate all tax tips? No. And it gives like a summary. Each one of them gives like this small thing, but then it has a longer like explanation. And I'm going to concentrate on the longer ones. The 2025 tax bill created a new tax deduction that will allow some people who receive tip income through work in a specific list of occupations to deduct up to $25,000 in qualified tips from their taxable income for tax years 2025 through 2028. This only works for 3 years. Okay? Or I guess the math is maybe 4 years, but 3 years. The 2025 max deduction is per tax return, so married filers cannot double their deductions. Deductions begin to phase out at $150,000 in adjusted gross income for single filers or $300 for married filers. Workers will also still owe federal tax, payroll tax on their tips, and may owe state income taxes on tips. So this is only it's not even that you don't pay. You still have to show your income, tipped income on your tax. What this is a possible deduction that you could receive based on your tip income up to $25,000. So really, it's the more tips you make or the higher your income is, the more you actually will gain from this. Because this is everything across our tax system. The more you pay, the more, especially when it comes to deductible stuff, the more you earn, the more possibility of deduction you get. Who benefits from a tax deduction on tipped income? Employees of tipped workers are the biggest beneficiaries of the tax deduction on tip income because the policy will allow those employers to restrain or possibly cut some workers' already low wages to reduce labor costs. And this is something that I don't think people have considered yet. Among individual taxpayers, anyone who earned tips in an eligible tipped occupation and reports those tips on their federal income tax return is eligible for the tax benefit, but only if they owe federal income taxes. Only about 3 million workers, 1.7% of U.S. workers, work in traditionally tipped occupations and thus could be eligible for the benefits. However, a sizable share of tipped workers earn too little to have any federal income tax liability and would therefore not receive any tax benefit. Because the size of the deduction is directly proportional to tip income earned and to the worker's overall income level, eligible workers with the lowest income will benefit the least. Among those who benefit from the tax deduction, the average overall benefit will be about $1,400 in 2026. With higher earners receiving larger benefits and lower income tax filers receiving smaller ones. Among all taxpayers in the top 60% of income distribution, regardless of whether they receive tax deduction, the average benefit is between $40 and $45 per tax return. Most of the direct tax benefits of the policy will go to the middle and higher income, while the bottom 40% will see virtually no benefit, between $0 and $10 in tax savings in 2026. That's because more than a third, 37% of tipped workers earn too little to owe federal income tax. Workers who do not receive tips, the overwhelming majority of workers, do not benefit. How will a tax deduction for tips affect job quality for tipped workers? Tipped workers already face serious workplace challenges exacerbated by the way that they are compensated. These include low wages, greater income instability, as well as higher incidences of wage theft, discrimination, and potential abuse from employers and customers alike. No tax on tip addresses none of these problems. Instead, it creates conditions that could make tipped jobs even worse and put downward pressure on tipped workers' overall earnings for several reasons. One, although most tipped workers already receive only trivial base pay for their employers, from their employers, no tax on tips may derail or delay efforts to raise tipped minimum wages and could result in more workers either seeking or being shifted into tipped positions. Because employers can reduce their labor costs by relying more heavily on tipped workers, tipped staff may end up being tasked with additional work previously done by the non-tip employees. So you might wind up having to where they're going to fluctuate work more onto the non-tipped to the tipped employees because they will have more savings that way in the company because they're not paying out as much. They can reduce the amount of work that the non-tipped employees are making. In other words, making it to where the non-tipped employees are unnecessary or either shifting the non-tip employees to tipped employees. So whether your tipped employees are going to wind up with more work, your non-tipped employees are going to wind up with less work, and potentially even non-tipped employees being moved into tip positions just so that the companies can lower their labor costs. Public awareness of no tax on tips could result in customers tipping less as they perceive tipped workers as receiving unfair preferential tax treatment. That one I don't see happening really in a large scale because I think there has been a respect for the tip community, for tipped occupations, more so now than probably previously before, to some degree at least those that are like genuinely tip in occupations, understanding that they still make extremely low wages. So you're always going to have your assholes out there who don't want to tip very well at all. Or at all, very little or at all. But I'm not sure. I mean, it's possible that you could have a uptick on people tipping less because of this, but I don't feel like it's going to be a widespread issue. But I mean, it's possible though. Why are some workers paid with tips in the first place? Well, this is an interesting one. The U.S. tipping system originated in the aftermath of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery. Black workers were regulated to service sector jobs and to avoid paying them a wage. Okay, that was the point. It was to shift them into that type of work so that you would have less likely for them to actually make good wages, because people weren't going to tip them. They would tip the white people and not the black people. It was that's what it was from. Over time, the use of tipping to pay a worker's premium wage instead of as a bonus on top of the employer pay wages became an increasingly common practice for service sector employment. Maintaining this separate, unequal system for service sector wages has been a top lobbying priority of the restaurant industry ever since. I'm sorry. I'm having an issue that I will address later. Okay. How will tax deduction for tips influence employer behavior? A tax deduction for tips will encourage employers to rely more on tipped work and enable them to avoid raising workers' base wages. Under federal law, employers can pay tipped workers as little as $2.13 an hour. This is the federal law. So long as their workers receive over the course of a work week enough customer provided tips to bring workers' average hourly earnings up to the federal minimum wage of $7.25. So it's a way of customers compensating workers and basically even paying workers to work where the company doesn't have to pay them. And that's the way the tip industry works. It's a way of skewing wages onto customers instead of the company actually raising the wages and paying their workers. It's a fraudulent system, and honestly. Many states have set tipped minimum wages higher than the federal 213, but most retain a lower minimum wage for workers who receive tips, meaning that by law, employers in most of the country pay their tipped staff less than their non-tipped staff. Because of the preferential tax treatment of tips, some workers who may have otherwise been reluctant to accept this sub-minimal base wage may now be willing to do so. So, some people may trying to weigh out, okay, would I make more money as a tipped staff rather than a non-tipped staff? So some people might actually, especially if they are a non-tipped staff that still is making a minimum wage or a very low wage, if they could potentially make more in a tipped position because of this, and on top of they not being able to pay tax, not having to pay taxes at least, or having a tax deduction up to a certain point, they would actually do the math and figure out that they could make more money, or at least retain more money, by actually taking on a wage position. And employees may try to convert as many of their staff to tip positions as they can do so to lower labor costs. That's the other scenario that we've already spoken of, that employers would just move more people into that position so that they can then have less labor costs, which makes them more profits, and the wages are going to be pressed and placed on customers and consumers. This is going to be a continued problem. How will this policy affect non-tipped workers? No tax on tips will encourage employers to shift more of their labor cost, providing tips, and decrease pressure to raise minimum wage. This presses wages for other workers in the local economy, as employers compete to attract and retain staff. Now have less incentive to raise pay, and so this type of policy, this type of practice, where you have more employers moving people to tipped wages, lowering their cost, incentivizes them to not raise the base pay. And if you have more of those companies not raising the base pay, then companies that pay all their employees are going to be pressured to also not raise their base pay, because everybody's in competition, as the overall wage obligations for that local area, as far as cost of living and stuff, would remain low, because there are more people on lower wages. So it causes the whole entire industry to then incentivize them to actually keep wages low, which hurts everybody. It hurts the whole entire wage growth system for every employee. And then on top of that, in addition, the income tax deduction for tips is supposed to apply only to a specific list of occupations that customarily and regularly receive tips. However, the Department of Treasury has taken a broad interpretation of tipped occupations, ensuing proposed regulations on a list of nearly 70 occupations that would be eligible for the tax deduction on tips, including home maintenance, repair workers, plumbers, electricians, HVAC technicians. So that what has happened here is the Department of Treasury has created this list of potential tax on tips on occupations that normally don't receive tips, which would then cause those occupations and those employers to transfer their employees into a tipped type system, which would then broaden the tip industry, creating more occupations that haven't until now really been considered a tipped industry will then be a tipped industry, meaning those companies would then be able to make more earnings and more profits, and then pushing more and more of the wages onto the consumers. If you're not seeing what could potentially happen here and what they're actually creating a system of, we've already seen when this, and they actually go over this too. We've already seen an uptick in tipping across the entire industry as it is, where you have a lot of companies, restaurants and things like that don't even have like waiters and stuff that where you would typically tip, asking for tips. You have tips being asked for everywhere, and that's something that we have seen over the last decade more and more and more in industries that typically didn't tip and or even ask for tips, are asking for tips, hoping to just get more revenue that way. And in order to like exacerbate that, this administration is in placing this policy in a way to incentivize employers to actually do that, to actually implement more and more of a tip-based employment system, which then would put more and more Americans, as already stated, on an income that is unstable, because it would have to require customers to supplement those wages through tips. And when you have an ever increasing system, an employment system of tips, and customers seeing that more and more reliant on them to help people actually make a living, that's going to apply more pressure on people to tip, which then will cause more customers to tip less, in my opinion. How will this policy affect me as a consumer? Will I be asked to tip more frequently? We've already seen that. We've already talked about it. This incentive to shift more labor to tip receive jobs means consumers could be asked to tip more frequently, in which recent years we've already seen this tipping culture proliferate, with customers being prompted to give larger tips or tip in contexts where it traditionally was not expected. This is going to just exacerbate that whole situation. And then on top of that, no tax on tip also shrinks state and federal revenues, leading to fewer funds available for public services and goods, which they will continue to go on here. And that's something else that hasn't been brought up, is when you do this, then you have if states start to actually acclimate this into their state tax codes, which some have already decided to do, then they are and already projecting the effect that this is going to make, then tax revenue from on a state basis is also going to decrease, which means goods and services for that state is going to decrease and is going to become unavailable, like food assistance, healthcare assistance, child care assistance, things like that, roads, infrastructure, because they'll be getting less tax revenue and they'll be able to do less. How does a tax deduction for tips affect our tax code? Giving tipped income preferential treatment in the tax code makes our tax system less fair. Workers with similar pre-tax income should be treated similarly to in the tax code, regardless of how the income is earned, whether it's regular wages or tips. This is often referred to as horizontal equity. A retail cashier who works long hours for low pay should not face a higher tax bill than a restaurant server with the same income and hours simply because the cashier's income comes from a paycheck rather than tips. And that's going to be a problem. That's going to be a problem. That's going to cause this system that feels unfair for a lot of workers, especially as more and more industries decide to move their workers into a tip style income. How will a tax deduction for tips affect federal and state revenues? The Trump's tax bill tip income tax deduction will reduce federal government revenue by $10 billion in 2026 and nearly $32 billion over the next 10 years. Whether the policy affects state revenues and whether workers can claim the deductions on state tax depends on whether the state conforms to the federal tax code when defining taxable income, and in some cases, whether states choose to adopt analogous provisions in their state tax code. In Michigan, which adopted the recent federal tax changes into state law, the income tax deductions for tips, overtime, and Social Security will cost the state $158 million in its first year of implementation. $158 million. Arizona and Colorado have indicated that they will conform with the policy and are therefore expected to lose an estimate of $24 million and $90 million in annual revenue, respectively. The Institution on Taxation and Economic Policy estimates that if all states with income taxes decided to adopt the tip deduction, it would lead to a loss of $2.74 billion in state revenue in 2026 alone. That is wild. That is wild. Are income tax deductions an effective way to increase wages, take-home pay? Federal tax deductions only benefit workers who earn qualified income, and become the federal income tax system is progressive. People with large incomes are taxed at higher rates. The benefits of income tax deductions are skewed towards higher earners. Household earnings the most income receive the biggest benefits, and the lowest earning households do not benefit at all. As a result, tax deductions are generally not well-targeted methods for raising the income of low and middle income workers, narrowing racial and gender income gaps, or addressing poverty and inequality. Income tax deductions are also often temporary. The deduction of tips expires after 2028, so they do not provide durable benefits to workers. Moreover, some income tax deductions include the deduction for tipped income, exclude people based on their tax filing status. For example, taxpayers who are married filing separately and taxpayers who do not have Social Security numbers cannot claim the deduction. And this is an ongoing thing when it comes to our federal government, regardless of whether we're talking about Republican controlled or the Democratic controlled. It's the fact that when it comes to tax deductions for the rich and wealthy, for corporations, they implement those permanently. They put them in place and they go, that's what it's going to be permanently, until another administration comes in and decides to somehow overthrow that if they can or whatever, which sometimes is a vigorous in itself. But when it comes to stuff around actual regular workers, average Joes, the low, middle income earners, any kind of deduction is always sunsetted. And it's usually sunsetted between 3 and 5 years. Always. There's never an implementation of something that they go, we're going to do this and we're going to do this permanently. It just doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. And if that is not telling, Are there better ways to raise tipped and non-tipped workers' take-home pay? Yes. The federal bill to raise the minimum wage and phase out the tipped minimum wage would benefit nearly 23 million workers, 2.8 million of which are tipped workers, with affected workers receiving 3,200 more in wages every year thereafter. Over a 10-year period, raising the federal minimum wage would provide 18 times more income to workers than the no tax on tips deduction. A minimum wage increase also benefits the lower paid workers the most, while no tax on tips excludes the lower income workers entirely. Beyond raising the minimum wage, there are several other effective and more equitable policies to support working families, including expanding the earned income tax credit or the child tax credit, providing workers with paid sick leave and paid family and medical leave, and supporting workers' rights to form and join unions. That is correct. But Republicans are never going to do that. As a matter of fact, half of the Democrats would never do that. They just won't. But absolutely no Republicans will. And that's the way you would actually be able to raise income, is just literally by raising the minimum wage. That's the reason why ones like Bernie Sanders have advocated for this for decades. He's literally advocated for raising the minimum wage damn near as long as he's been in Congress. Because that is the only actually lucrative, definitive way to bring people out of poverty, to actually increase lower income workers' pay and give them a better opportunity and a better way of life, is to literally raise their fucking wages. All this does is curtail wages onto the consumers, hoping that the consumers will actually take it. The tax deduction for tips income was included in a larger tax bill. Does the tax bill benefit workers? No. The harm caused by the Trump tax bill will greatly exceed any benefit for most working people. The bill included a small set of small temporary tax deductions for some workers who earn tips and overtime, and created new, poorly targeted child savings accounts, while the rest of the legislation hands huge tax giveaways to the rich at the expense of the working class. The Trump tax bill will give a $1 trillion tax cut to the richest 1% over the next decade. Do you understand that? Do you understand that? They give a tax deduction on tips for low income people that actually doesn't really even benefit the lowest of income people. It only really benefits more people that have slightly higher wages but still get tipped. And it sunsets within 3 years. But they give $1 trillion in tax cuts to the richest 1% over the next decade because it's permanent. It pays for these cuts by slashing an equivalent amount of funding for Medicaid and SNAP. The bill also massively expanded funding for the Department of Homeland Security and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, providing them the resources to implement the administration's mass deportation agenda, an agenda that would destroy jobs for both immigrants and native-born workers. In contrast, the bill added no new funding to federal agencies that enforce workers' rights. So while the administration in Trump has been trumpeting this no tax on tips thing for a while now as some sort of major tax deduction, tax cut for low and middle class. It actually is not, and could potentially cause more harm in the long run because it will potentially incentivize companies in this for-profit system we have in order to lower their labor costs to make more profit, move more of their workers into tipped positions that were not traditionally considered tip workers. And they were being assisted by that by the Department of Treasury actually identifying a more broad-scoped list of occupations to potentially be tipped occupations. Pressing more of the wages onto customers and consumers, and also suppressing overall income wages or the advocacy for raising income wages for all workers in America. So there you go. Welcome to the new tipping income, tipping workers of America. So now not only is it about an income system that originated in slavery to restrict wages to black citizens is now being used, and that was by supremacist white leadership at the time, is now being used by the rich and wealthy and the ones in control to now put that type of system onto as much of the workforce as they can to restrict your wages and put you under an even larger bind and instability on wages while they continue to take all the tax cuts and money that they can. Potentially turning our employment system into a, who knows, complete tip system. And I know you probably think, oh, that could never happen. One thing I've learned from this administration and the people in power, never say never, because if they can get away with it, they will. Thank you for joining me. Let me know what you think. Do you think this is going to be a net positive for low and middle income workers? Is this something good? Or do you agree and see that this could potentially really, really hurt our employment system all across America? Suppressing wages and potentially shifting much of our employment into that system. Thank you very much for joining me. Until next time, peace. Clear Talk. I'm out.